Hello, everybody. Today, I want to talk about recent work we've done at the Creative Machines Lab here at Columbia, where we look at this idea of visual self-modeling. There is a paper that you can download at the link below with all the details. You can also download the code and try it out for yourself. But I want to describe here what we did at a very high level. So this paper is all about this idea of self-modeling. Now, we humans have this kind of mental self-image of what we look like. Sometimes that self-image is inflated, sometimes it's realistic, sometimes it's diminished. But regardless of how accurate our self-model is, it's very useful. It allows us to do things like climb trees and play ball and climb upstairs and see if we can fit through a narrow passageway. We use our self-model all the time to get dressed up in the morning to do all kinds of physical activities without bumping into things, without tripping over and so on. That self model that we have of ourselves, that mental image, probably develops over time. It starts probably when we're an infant and we're playing around in the crib, playing with toys, bumping into things, and largely and gradually understanding how we move and how we function and what our body shape or morphology is like. Robots also have a self image. In fact, we don't call it a self-image when it comes to robotics. We call it a simulation or a kinematic, a forward kinematic model. These are technical terms, but they have the same purpose. They allow the robot to plan virtually rather than physically. So robots plan things, plan motion virtually using their kinematic models. If you're using artificial intelligence, the robot learns typically in virtual world in the simulation before it learns in physical reality. In fact, I would say that most results out there, most amazing results that we see robots doing incredible things over time have been accomplished in simulation first. So a big question is, where does that simulation come from? So in traditional robotics, these simulations come, these kinematic models come from an engineer. There's an engineer that actually provides analytical equations or CAD models to the robot so the robot can do planning. In this paper, we explored an alternative approach, and that is that the robot would create its own self-simulation, its own mental image of what it's like and how it moves. So we put a robot inside a circle of 5 cameras, 5 streaming cameras that stream the images back into the robot. The robot undulates inside that circle of cameras, very much like a child moving around in a hall of mirrors, looking at itself. And as it moves around, it begins to get all that feedback about how it looks. The robot takes all this information, all these images, and it begins to form a self-image, which is captured as a big neural network, a big, deep neural network. That neural network in the beginning is all over the place. It sort of believes that the robot is, everywhere and nowhere all at the same time, but that model is inconsistent with the images. So gradually it goes back and forth, testing the model against the images, removing parts that don't appear in the images, adding parts that do appear there, going back and forth for about 3 hours until it gets something that looks pretty good. So here you can see in the beginning, you can see the black robot in the foreground. You can see that fuzzy thing in the background. In the beginning, it's all over the place. And over time, it gradually shrinks like a shrink wrap and narrows down over the robot itself. Now, once the robot has this model, it can do useful things with it. Here, for example, we asked the robot to try to touch that red sphere while avoiding the red box. And you can see the robot contorts, trying to minimize the distance to the sphere while maximizing the distance from the red box. And without knowing anything about its own kinematics, it manages to do that pretty nicely. Here it is doing that again from a different point of view. You can see how it's sort of contorting and trying to get that sphere without touching that box. Again, it does that without being given anything about its own kinematics and its own morphology, as is done in typical robotic systems. So in the paper, we explore lots of different ways in which that robot can move and all kinds of tasks that it can do with that self-image that it developed of itself. And we also measured the accuracy, and it turns out that the accuracy of that self model is about 1% of the workspace. That's more or less the same accuracy that we humans can see ourselves. If you close your eyes and you try to reach to grab let's say a cup of water, you're kind of going to miss by about 1% of your body size. And that's more or less what the robot does. We also tested to see if that self-image that the robot has of itself changes as the motors flex. And you can see as the joint motors flex, contract, and expand and rotate, the self-image also changes. In other words, the self-model is kinematic. It's not just a static model, it's a kinematic model, which means the robot can use it for all kinds of motion planning as well. I want to put this a little bit into context with history. So again, robots have been out there for decades, and they always had some kind of ability to model and simulate themselves and plan. So how was that done in the past? So for most of robotic history, it's been done using analytical models. Some engineer wrote down equations that describe how the robot moves, or at least how the end effector, the robot hand, the gripper, or the foot of the robot, the part that we're interested in, changes over time as function of the motor's command. So that's an analytical model. In the past maybe 10 years, we've seen a lot of work on data-driven models, which again correlate the motion commands of the motors with the position of the end effector. These are all input-output maps. They're very concise. We have an interesting paper also linked below that describes a data-driven model for modeling the end effector. But what we wanted to do is move beyond modeling just points to model the entire shape of the robot. Again, getting inspiration from the way we humans and babies we understand our body not as a point, but as actually as a whole, sort of in a holistic way. So can we do that? So this is what we did, and you can see here again what that looks like. And after it converges, that model is not 100% accurate, but it is sort of wrapped around the robot pretty nicely. And the way we did that is using a slightly different architecture. Instead of input-output, this is a query-based model where you give it the joint angles and you ask it, is the robot, am I occupying this portion of space, or am I occupying that portion of space? And the model says yes or no, or what is the probability? And that kind of probabilistic way of thinking about what portion of the space around you you're occupying is a much broader and more useful model. I think it's a bit closer to the way we humans see ourselves. All right, I want to end with this, a little bit of context. As some of you may know, I'm really passionate about this question of robot self-awareness, consciousness, sentience. Can robots understand what they are? And I'm driven by the fact that, most of science fiction movies with robots always have self-aware robots. These robots can be happy, they can be bad, they can be sad. They have emotions, and they're always self-aware. In contrast, we don't have a lot of information of what really self-awareness is. What is it in humans that makes us self-aware? And I've looked at lots of books and cognitive science and psychology, and there's not a lot of answers into what makes for self-awareness, and certainly not how we can build it. So our approach in our lab is to try to build it mechanically inside a robot, and our approach is to describe self-awareness as simply the ability to imagine yourself in the future. Very, very practical definition of self-awareness. So for example, if you can imagine yourself on the beach tomorrow, you can hear the waves, and you can smell the ocean, you can feel the sand under your feet, you are self-aware because you can imagine yourself. A dog can also imagine itself probably, but not as far ahead. Maybe a dog can imagine the taste of lunch, but dog is not thinking about next year or about retirement. They're only thinking short term. So our ability to see ourselves in the future is the root of consciousness, of self-awareness. And what differs, why we humans are different, distinguishes us from others, is how far into the future we can see. But that self-model is also very useful, as I mentioned earlier, to plan. If you need to cross this pond or climb a tree, you can sort of imagine how you'd move your body parts in order to accomplish that. And that is exactly what the robot is doing here. You can see it's first imagining how it's going to reach that red sphere, and then it executes the commands to actually instantiate that motion. So it's using its self-image to look into the future. All right, I hope you enjoy the paper, and I'll see you next time.